Hi, and welcome to the Theatre History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. From the very beginning, theatre in Ireland has been shaped by brilliant, creative women, from Lady Gregory to more contemporary playwrights such as Marina Carr. However, these women have often been overshadowed by their male contemporaries, and they haven't always received their due. One such playwright is Teresa Deevy, who was acclaimed as a genius when the Abbey Theatre began staging her plays in the 1930s. But she soon fell into relative obscurity, and it's only in the last few decades that scholars and theatre makers have begun to reconsider her plays and figure out just how effective they are on stage. Today, we're lucky to have as our guests two of the scholars who are contributing to this renewal of interest in Teresa Deevy. Dr. Una Kealy and Dr. Kate McCarthy are both lecturers in the School of Humanities at the Waterford Institute of Technology in Ireland. Together, they organized a conference in February of 2021 on the playwright and her work called Active Speech, Sharing Scholarship on Teresa Deevy. They're also co-editors of the forthcoming book, Active Speech, Critical Perspectives on Teresa Deevy. Kate and Una, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Mike. We're delighted to be here.
Thank you, Mike.
How did Deevy's early life shape her, both as a person and a playwright? I understand from some of the materials that you gave me to prepare for this, that Deevy's life is really marked by tragedy in her early years, right up to the premiere of her first major play in 1930.
Yes, Mike, if I can take you back to her early years. So Teresa Deevy was born in Waterford. She was the youngest of 13 children. And even at that young age, she experienced tragedy. So 3 of her siblings were lost in infancy, Una, isn't that correct?
2 in infancy.
Two, excuse me. And then a sister of hers, who was a nun, died during the Spanish flu epidemic. But Deevy came from a very interesting middle-class family. Her family were well known for their sympathies with the nationalist cause. And in fact, Teresa's uncle, he was a parish priest, and he held very political views and supported the Land League. So in Ireland, this was an important movement at the beginning of the 20th century that called for reform of the landlord system. And in expressing those views, her uncle was actually silenced. And this idea of silence is something that Deevy comes back to time and time again in her work. Her father died when she was very young, she was 3, and that left her mother, Mary Fian Deevy, to rear their family alone. But Mary Deevy was very committed and interested in education and providing education for all of her children. So upon reaching secondary school age, Deevy attended the St. Mary Secondary School in the Ursuline Convent as a boarder. And this would have been quite unusual because that school was located a very short walk from the house in Waterford. But this aligned with what middle-class families did at the time, what children from those families did at the time. And we know so Una and I have been doing some work on Deevy's school years and the education she experienced. And we know that she experienced, I suppose, what we now consider an ideal learning environment. She experienced socially interactive, participatory, extracurricular activities, both within the formal curriculum and in the informal curriculum. So, for example, there were music recitals, debating clubs, evenings of readings that the students would prepare, debates amongst themselves, but also, I suppose, guest lecturers coming to give them as a group some just really thought-provoking speeches. So we know that Deevy and her classmates could express their voice. They had a platform for their creative expression, and that was St. Ursula's Annual, which is a unique archive that Una and I have been very fortunate to engage with in the last 2 years. Una, do you want to add a little bit to that?
I'd love to. The learning environment that Deevy was immersed in during her adolescence and her early womanhood has all the ingredients to make up a political feminist activist. The debates that the girls were involved with were directly influenced by the suffrage movement in Ireland and Europe, and I suppose particularly the UK at that time. They were also the culture, the artistic culture the artistic curriculum that the girls were invited to create as well as participate in also was directly influenced by the Celtic revival, the Irish revival, which celebrated the separatism, I suppose, of Irish culture to that of English culture. And we see evidence of this within the poetry, within even the typography, within the Ursula's annuals. We also see that the platform that St. Ursula's Annual provided Deevy and her peer group was not the only vehicle to allow them to create and articulate their artistic innovations, because it wasn't just the written word that gave them voice. It was the ability and the freedom they had to create theatre productions themselves. So they were encouraged to write their own plays, to produce them, to write their own poetry and songs. So we have from the very early years the perfect ground to create thinkers, artists, scientists, politicians of the future. And of course, what we also found out in that research into St. Ursula's archives there was the fact that the school was allied with universities in the UK, which were intent on developing innovative educational practices. And Deevy was exposed to this as well. So we have a unique kind of ingredient of nationalism, feminism, and politics within this educational system. And you can see, as Kate said, this is where the seeds were sown for what blossoms in Deevy's work as she moves into the 1930s in particular.
And as you said, Mike, I suppose 1930 marks a particularly sad year because her mother died in 1930, and it was Mary Deevy who really championed Deevy as a writer and encouraged her to invent stories about the everyday and her experience. And in 1936, when Deevy's first play Reapers was the first collection of plays was published, she dedicated that to her mother with the note, "To Mother as we planned." So you get the sense that to have a woman as your mother who was so inspirational, that it really kept her going through the other challenge which she faced, of course, which was her deafness during her university years.
Yes, I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about that. Deevy is deaf at a time when disability is not perhaps fully understood or in many cases acknowledged. So this seems like a really significant influence on her identity, on her work, and perhaps how that work was perceived as well.
Yes, Deevy became deaf aged about 19 from Meniere's disease. She wasn't the only member of her family who became deaf from Meniere's disease, actually. Her sister Fan also became deaf as a result of Meniere's disease. And Deevy's reaction to her deafness, I suppose, is characteristic of her reaction to most things in her life. She was in the middle of her undergraduate degree in University College Dublin. She was studying for an arts degree there. She had to discontinue her studies at first. She transferred her studies to University College Cork, possibly because she might have been a student at the Eye and Ear Hospital there. Nevertheless, despite her deafness and this traumatic event that happened during her third level education, which, could have really cast her off course in terms of her degree program, it didn't. She got her degree and then went to London to live with her sister, married sister in London. She learned lip reading there. That was the fashion for overcoming that disability at that time, and went to the theatre to practice and learn her lip reading. And after a while in London, or by the time she returned to Ireland when she was 25, she had decided that I can do that. I can write plays. I can write plays about Ireland, and I'm going to do that. And for the next 10 years, she pursued that. She wrote 2 plays, sent them to the Abbey. They were rejected. As ever, Deevy didn't give up. She wrote, she did what Samuel Beckett would have told her to do if he'd been her friend at that time. He would have told her, fail again, fail better. That's what she did. She wrote The Reapers, won first prize with that, a joint first prize with T.C. Murray, I think. And how did her deafness impact then on her career? Maybe Kay'll talk a little bit more about that, but I suppose how it impacted on people's reactions to her is quite interesting. There are very negative comments which reveal much more about people's prejudices than they reveal about Deevy herself. But Lady Gregory mentioned her as that deaf woman. And Joseph Holloway, the famous Abbey diarist, who was not known for his sympathy, I suppose, called her a shrieking spinster. So yeah, even saying that phrase, it's so offensive on so many levels. And I think we get a slight window through that phrase into the kind of prejudicial attitudes that were pervasive at that time. But it's right to remember that Deevy had some really important champions as well, who saw past any disability or any prejudice that society might have had around disability. Two of these really important champions were Lennox Robinson and also later Denis Johnson. Lennox Robinson would have been very interested in championing Deevy as within the theatre, and Denis Johnson championed Deevy and produced her work in the pioneering days of television in the 1950s, certainly. So it's interesting to think of the challenges that she faced. We know from her correspondence, when she went to the theatre, she found it easiest to sit in the front row of the dress circle so that she could see most clearly what was happening on stage, so that she could lip read. She often read scripts before she went to the theatre so that she would have a full understanding. We know how important the physical body was to her work, and I think Kate will pick this up in a minute, but her relationship with the Abbey Theatre finished at the end of the 1930s. Deevy then turned her attention to writing for radio, and Emily Bloom's done some wonderful work on how Deevy wrote for radio and the way that she would have gone to sit and watch performances, watch radio shows being performed to get an understanding of that. And maybe Kate, you might pick a bit of that up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting avenues that came from our conference last month was, and it's not a new area of scholarship in Deevy. People have talked about this idea of embodiment before, but this understanding that she was a theatre maker, and whether because of her deafness, but I think we would add to that because specifically of this wonderfully rich education she received, there is this acute sense of the visual in her work. And that comes from the experience of reading text, but also of seeing a lot of work. We know that she saw a lot of Chekhov, and Shaw in particular was one of her favourites in London. And in terms of kind of another addition to this idea of the public perception, I mean, she was enormously successful in the 30s. I think she was, correct me if I'm wrong, the most produced playwright at the Abbey in the 1930s. We also see during this period, so her plays on tour. So Lennox Robinson in 1938 produced Katie Roach at the Church Theatre in London. The Abbey Players took Katie Roach on tour to the United States. So it played on Broadway at the Ambassador Theatre in 1937. It received less than positive reviews by one of the critics there, Brooks Atkinson, I suppose, who was critical of the kind of ill-conceived Chekhovian style, and was much more looking forward to the Abbey's version of The Plough and the Stars the following week. But nevertheless, her work was, even when she was silenced and excluded from the canon post-1930s, Katie Roach in particular is one of the texts that is revived throughout the 20th century. And Ria Mooney, who initially played Amelia Gregg in Katie Roach, but then produced Katie Roach in 1949, she talked about Deevy being one of the key new voices of the second generation, placing her alongside Sean O'Casey and Dennis Johnston as one of the most notable personalities. So amongst her peers and the networks in which Deevy was moving in terms of theatre professionals, she was very well regarded by some people and championed by those as well.
You know, we've mentioned certainly Deevy's upbringing, some of the feminism and some of the nationalist leanings of some of the members of her family. We've mentioned a number of names connected with the Abbey Theatre. This is all happening, her career, the height of her career, at least at the Abbey, is happening in the 1930s. And some very important things are happening both in Irish society and politics, but also on the stages of Ireland. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of wider context and how it affects both Deevy's plays, but also maybe what she has to struggle against?
Yeah, I can take a little bit of that. The context of Ireland at that time is particularly relevant to and interesting to anybody thinking about studying Deevy's work. There was a housing boom in the 1930s and in Ireland, and this housing boom provided a huge increase in social housing. It provided an opportunity for slum clearance. This wasn't uncommon in Europe at this time, but elsewhere in Europe, the housing boom and the slum clearance coincided with a corresponding expansion in welfare state provision. That didn't happen in Ireland. We had this housing boom, but we didn't have a corresponding expansion of welfare state provision. The house as a place of profound symbolic importance, which impacts on the psychology, on the physicality, on the potential of the people who live within those houses, I suppose it can't be understated, the importance. So that there's a direct correlation between what's happening in Deevy's work and what's happening in Irish society. The housing is one aspect of that. Another aspect is the fact that we have in 1932 the Eucharistic Congress being held in Ireland, which is the visit of the papal hierarchy to Ireland in this massive show of strength and splendor. And this happened at a very important time because the church, under the hierarchy of the Irish Catholic Church at the time, was consolidating strength and power and very much putting into play what Smith calls the architecture of containment around the institutions that we are hearing so much of in the media at the moment, the mother and baby homes, the Magdalen laundries. The other aspects of that architecture of containment included mental institutions, all kinds of unofficial organizations which contained what would have been considered as deviance within society. Alongside that, you had increasing censorship by the church and by lay organizations allied to the church. So the Knights of Columbanus, the vigilance societies, etc. Then you have the state itself legislating against women's freedoms with the Jury's Bill. There's a raft of legislation that was passed from 1929 right up to 1937, culminating in Bunreacht na hÉireann, which is the Irish Constitution. All of these working to contain particularly women and to relegate them into this space, which is the home. And of course, the home now coming back in as a really important symbolic place within Irish society.
And we could also add to this, what's happening in the 30s then is this sense of an increasing secularization, where this idea of how women perform their identity is now at odds with the prevailing ideology of what it means, what womanhood means, which our constitution to this day equates with motherhood. So coming back to, I suppose, how we see this in Deevy's work, we see it in small moments. For example, in at the opening of Katie Roach, Katie wishes to go to the dance after the Coolbeg Regatta, and she describes this dance, with great excitement. It's to be the last dance of her life. So again, the sense of the protagonist wanting to express herself physically through the body. And then we contrast that with her employer, Amelia Gregg, who refuses to allow her to go to a dance at that hour. So it's just a small moment, but it sums up this idea that there was a cultural purity, as historian Diarmaid Ferriter would say, that was built into the nationalist cause that we see time and time again within the early decades of the Abbey's work as well. But this kind of mythical purity was symbolised in this idea of Mother Ireland. And Katie, even in that moment of wanting to move beyond and move her body and dance and experience youthful exuberance, that is absolutely cannot be allowed. She must be contained, as Una so rightly said, within the home. So we have this inextricable link between then motherhood and womanhood in our constitution, which is actually, that article is currently under review. The Irish Human Rights Association has critiqued it for its gender stereotyping, because on the one hand it celebrates if someone wants to make that decision to work at home, but there actually isn't government support for that. Or if you are a man and you wish to work from home in that role, that's not of course it is an option, but in the constitution the language suggests otherwise. So even though we have these concerns of the 30s, as Una has said, the ramifications of what's happening in the 30s and these ideologies and this cementing of the church and state, we are feeling the ramifications of that in 2021.
And I suppose that's why we find so much resonance and relevance within Deevy's work now. And I know I might be jumping on to another point in the conversation, but sometimes I stress when I'm working with my own students that yes, we might be thinking about a play that's written in the 1930s that says a lot about Ireland in the 1930s, but issues of power, of direction, how people get moved around, how particularly women can be moved around, and as Annie Kinsella is in The King of Spain's Daughter, literally pushed around. She's pushed around the stage in between barriers that are erected by men that steer her along a path, and where women such as Mrs. Marks in The King of Spain's Daughter enters the stage, and the first thing she does is she asks permission to come into the space. And so we have women asking permission to come into a space, other women being pushed around the space, women pushing other women around the space and telling other women how they ought to behave within the space. And the consequences of this, not only the physical, but the psychological consequences of this for women and for men who allow this ideology to be perpetrated and who don't question the prevailing wisdom. We see that same dynamic expressed when it comes to prejudice of any sort, be that prejudice against women, prejudice against those with disabilities, prejudice against people of colour, transgender people and communities. Deevy's work deals with and excavates and takes apart the idea of prejudice and how prejudice can be perpetrated and how we can unknowingly be a part of a system that is really quite negative.
That's a really interesting description of kind of what is perhaps at the core of Deevy's work and how it reflects both the times in which she lives and perhaps to some degree what's going on today. And I'm curious, we've mentioned a few of the main plays here. Katie Roach, you've referenced her one-act play, The King of Spain's Daughter. What kinds of plays, for those who might not be familiar with Deevy's work, is she producing at this height of her career on stage in the 1930s?
She's producing, I suppose this is a really interesting question, Mike, because it's coming right in the middle of some thinking that Una and I are doing around how you think about Deevy's work on this kind of continuum of representation. So the scholarship, and we know that she's writing in this realist style, And so we have the authentic set and settings of the cottage or the side of the road. And we know that the characters use this naturalistic prose dialogue. But there are times within each of the plays during the 30s, and particularly some of the later radio dramas, or the later plays that were made for radio or produced for radio, that whatever she's trying to explore, the themes and the inner turmoil of the character, cannot fully be expressed within the realist style. And what happens is we get this move into expressionism. Not fully, particularly during the 30s, but this real sense of the language failing the characters to fully express what they mean. So, for example, in Katie Roach, you get this line, oh, you know what?
Oh, the bread, the butter, and to fill the jug.
That's it, which might seem like a kind of a throwaway, but it's something else. And it's a pattern that occurs during the play, and you're thinking, like, what is this about? Or there are these moments where maybe a character might, for example, in The Cellar of My Friend, which is both our keynote speakers, Professor Anne Shanahan, Professor Chris Morash, both looked at this text, which hasn't received a huge amount of scholarship, but this idea that we have this character who is framed almost like within an impressionistic painting. She's wearing this floral dress, she's outside in nature, she's carrying a basket of roses that isn't contained in any kind of way. And, you know, Una and I we kept coming back to this text trying to figure out, I mean, what is going on here? So at the height of her career here, I mean, I think we would put these plays within the realist style, but there are moments that break out into expressionism, which is why you can get productions that prioritize one style or the other. So with Katie Roach, the Mint Theatre in New York really emphasized that realist style and voice. At the Abbey production with Caroline Byrne in 2017 really took the expressionistic elements within the text and heightened them. Amanda Coogan in Theatre of the Deaf took The King of Spain's Daughter and appropriated it and immersed us in this live art performance that really put the body at the centre. Una, do you want to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I suppose this is why you should never come on a podcast when you kind of haven't worked it out in your head.
But this is the honesty of the working.
I love the honesty, and I'm going to expose a bit more now. What we know from the great scholarship that's been done already on Deevy is that Deevy's work is, yes, influenced by Chekhov, but moves out of that naturalistic dialogue, realistic dialogue, into a kind of a poetic lyricism. And if we are not describing it very well, that's because we haven't really figured it out yet in our own heads. We know that there's work to be done to explore how you might define this kind of work that Deevy is doing. The nearest thing I can think of it is Robert Welch's attempt to describe what Synge does, and he calls it a transfigured realism. And he spends a lot of time trying to describe and define what that is. But you know, when you read Playboy of the Western World, or you read In the Shadow of a Glen, you know you're in a different space there, in a different linguistic and in a different physical space in those plays than you are with Chekhov, right? With Chekhov, we know everything is unsaid. We know huge moments of development are happening in the spaces between what is said. But the language, Chekhov says, you know, they talk about the weather, and he puts that restraining order on himself as a playwright, where the characters are limited by their inarticulacy almost. In Deevy, I think something else is happening. Synge's characters aren't limited by their inarticulacy at all. In fact, the opposite. They are full of verbal expression. They explode with their language, you know? And particularly Playboy of the Western World, we get all that fabulous, that richness in the language. Deevy's characters don't do that either. They're not Chekhov and they're not Synge, right? So they're somewhere else. And they're more, for me, they're more Lorca. They move into that beautiful lyricism. We have this, it's like modernist, this imagist poetry where we have everything said in the tightest possible frame of language. And at times, Deevy's characters say, almost to Deevy, no, we're not going to put up with that limitation. I'm going to say something. And then they might come out with a verse of a poem in the way that Annie Kinsella does in The King of Spain's Daughter. She talks about white ships, the brown bogs, the white sails. She sees the sun, the adventure. She sees color in the bride's dresses. She doesn't accept what the reality is. The bride's dress is grey, but not to Annie. It's shimmering green. It's gold. It's, it's red. And what am I saying, Kate? I'm saying that Deevy's moving. She's not contained in the kind of realistic vibe of theatre that was happening in the Abbey at the time. She's moving.
Yeah, and this is like something we're talking about again at the conference and in our own conversations since then. But Una and I teach Deevy across many different modules on our English and Theatre Studies programme, including in the modern drama module. So when you start to think about her as a modernist, or start to think about her within the avant-garde, so that, Lorca, it's a very good reference there, also writing in the 30s, a playwright also privileging women and their sexual agency or lack thereof, also in a country that is Catholic. So there's another paper there now for somebody. But one of the things, a note, I think it was from Dr. David Clare, our colleague in Limerick, he mentioned at the conference that in the Gate archive, so there's a kind of a big project ongoing with the Gate, there was a collaboration announced between Deevy and MacLeamore in 1948, so a collaboration to happen in 1949 with her text Holiday House. So the Gate was known for introducing audiences to avant-garde works. So again, even though is no longer being produced at the Abbey, here we have this sense of her work and these later plays that other theatre practitioners, professionals, recognising the sense of the avant-garde, that modernist leanings within that work. And there's lots of, kind of work to be done there. But that's very exciting for us in terms of opening up other ways we can interpret her style. And in the same way that she challenged the containing of men and women within boundaries, that we must do the same. We must challenge those assumptions that we might have about her work as researchers and as teachers.
Yeah, and I suppose what part of the work that Kate and I were doing for the conference and to kind of for the edited collection on Deevy is based on a correspondence between Deevy and a friend of hers, Jim Chasty, who was a playwright in Waterford. And their correspondence reveals that Deevy is active in terms of seeking studio productions of her work in the 1950s, which of course is a period of time when traditionally the Abbey was said to have been quite staid and conservative. Now that's a blanket statement and it's inaccurate in its generalization, I think, because we have moments of experimentation and interest in the Abbey in the 40s and the 50s, and Dennis Johnson, of course, and the production of King Lear in the Abbey was important. But what I'm trying to say is that Dublin's a small place in the 40s and the 50s. It's still a small place. But the theatre community then in Dublin is a smaller population again. And in order to survive, the theatre population had to adapt. And actors and directors, designers, had to be able to work everywhere. They had to work in the Abbey, they had to be able to work in the Gate, they had to be able to work in the small studio spaces if there was any money to pay them to do the work. And often they worked there anyway, even when there was no money to pay them to do their work. So we have a small and vibrant community of theatre practitioners in the 40s and 50s, many of whom were seeking alternatives to the Abbey and what the Abbey was doing under the directorship of Ernest Blythe. And the narrative thus far has been that Deevy was rejected by the Abbey in the 40s. Oh dear, what a shame. Career over, except she wrote a few radio plays. That's not to to negate the really wonderful work that's been done on Deevy. But I think it's fair to say the general accepted narrative of Deevy's career runs something along those lines. But we're now beginning to realise that theatre in Dublin in the 40s and 50s was much more interesting than we have been led to believe, because that research hasn't really existed. Now, with the wonderful work that's been done on the Gate, particularly, we're getting lots of really interesting research coming to light around Dublin theatres at that time. But we can now begin to understand that Deevy's place in the narrative is more nuanced and complex than we might have thought, and that Deevy's later work, the work post-1940s, is something that deserves much more attention in light of this emerging research around the production of modernist work in Dublin in the 40s and 50s.
Yes, I think, sort of my very limited sort of sense of Deevy was, sort of this falling off after the 1930s. But as you're saying, it sounds like there's really sort of this reevaluation, not just of her, the sort of the quote unquote height of her career, but sort of the later part too. I'm curious, though, how does that sort of go from the end of her career, the later decades of her life, to the fairly recent revival of interest? What's sort of the general arc of interest in Deevy, and what's been happening more recently?
Well, I suppose more recently what is happening, I think, is a revival of interest in her work within theatre as a discipline. And what I mean by that is scholars be really thinking about her work through the lens of feminist theatre scholarship, and then reflected or aligning with that then these interpretations of her plays. So for example, Caroline Byrne, who directed Katie Roach in 2017, she spoke to us during the interview we did with her for a practitioners panel about her challenge when she read that text. She found at times it was underwritten and overwritten. She could really sense the expressionistic elements, but then it moved again back into realism. And so she worked with the dramaturg Marina Regan to kind of reorient that text into the expressionist style. And that was then complemented beautifully by Joanna Scotcher's work. And then, so that played, that was in 2017, and that was on the main stage of the Abbey. Terrible now, I've set up the binary, but in the Peacock Theatre, which is, literally underneath the Abbey stage, where the more experimental work is usually seen produced, we had this marvel of an appropriation, which was Amanda Coogan and Dublin Theatre of the Deaf, as I mentioned, this appropriation of the King of Spain's Daughter. And the title of their production, their appropriation, was Talk Real Fine, Just Like a Lady, which is a line they got from Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam song. And what both of those productions, I suppose, were answering a little bit was there was a huge movement in Irish theatre in 2016 called Waking the Feminists, which Deevy would have absolutely loved. She would have been out the front in all the papers because it challenged the canon. And what had happened was the Abbey Theatre was celebrating its centenary. Oh no, it was past centenary. The commemoration of the state, wasn't it?
It was commemorating the 1916 rising.
Yes.
It's called Waking the Nation.
Waking the Nation, that was it. So the Waking the Nation programme listed 10 plays and only one was written by a woman, despite the wonderful legacy of so many in our research. And the utter irony of that also was the 1916 proclamation was founded on the principle of equality for all. So here we have again the way theatre and politics are so intertwined. So Caroline Byrne, she's talking about in this practitioners panel with us that although her production wasn't a response to that controversy, of course, by placing Deevy on the stage in the year immediately afterwards, a playwright who so championed women's voices and decisions and their bodies, there is a political statement in that. And with Amanda Coogan and the Dublin Theatre of the Deaf's work, they were trying to draw attention to the fact that Irish Sign Language, which is spoken by thousands of people in the country, was not at that point recognised as one of the official languages in Ireland, where we have Irish, English, and now Irish Sign Language. So they were also bringing this political theme to the work. So the recent revivals that we've seen in Dublin, I think, are really responding to this global movement about using the arts, harnessing the arts to address issues of inequality, to highlight areas where social change is needed. But they do that from within the art form. They don't compromise the aesthetic quality and value of the work in an effort to make us critically reflect on the world in which we live. And that's when it's really powerful and when it works so well.
That's political theatre at its best.
Yeah. Even though we would never put Deevy in the political theatre category, like you might some, but that for me anyway has been the strength of those recent revivals in Ireland.
Yeah, and I suppose it has to be said that the impact of the Waking the Feminist movement, which was, I suppose, initiated in many ways by Leanne Bell, and we owe her a great debt of credit for that. And the team led by Brenda Donoghue, who created the Gender Counts research, which was commissioned by Waking the Feminists, identified that our women practitioners, be they designers, lighting, sound, costume, set, writers, directors, they're always less likely to be employed or to be paid as much as their male contemporaries. And Deevy's work talks about inequality and talks about prejudice and talks about a system that is perpetuated because we don't challenge it and we don't question it and we don't see it often. We don't recognize it. We feel it. And that's what Deevy's characters do. They feel in the body and the body responds. And of course, there is the very interesting direction of Irish theatre studies at the moment, which is to understand that the written text, the literary text, is not the prime object for our attention and concern and analysis. And so the revival of Deevy, it comes at a time when there is much greater interest and expertise in trying to appreciate the non-literary aspects of a text and analyze them. And I think it seems to me that, now I find myself here in this moment, having at this point in the conversation, I think, oh yeah, that's why Deevy is being, that's why Deevy is so ripe now to be reconsidered and reinterpreted. We're perhaps now at a stage of sophistication in Irish theatre scholarship where we understand the resonances of how prejudice might be explored on the stage through the body. What would you say to that, Kate?
I would completely agree. I mean, we finally worked it out.
Yeah, I'm struck in listening to both of you talk about Deevy and her legacy, how much this, in some ways, in very broad strokes, reflects a process we've seen elsewhere, other countries besides Ireland. You have a playwright who is maybe a big deal, sort of at a certain time in their career, and then they sort of maybe get forgotten to a certain degree, and then suddenly people rediscover them and they say, wow, this is really compelling stuff. This is really speaking to where we are as a community, as a country, whatever, in this moment. I'm just curious, do either of you think that you've sort of learned anything about this larger process of looking back on and revising our sense of who matters in theatrical history?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Una and I suppose, if I can speak for her, we probably put the role of teacher before researcher in how we define the work that we do. And for me, it comes back to, Deevy has taught me to pick up that mantle. I'm not always successful at doing it. And we're celebrating International Women's Day next week, and its theme is Choose to Challenge. And how, as a teacher, I do that? How do I challenge the curriculum that's in the anthology that the students can afford, the type of voices I include the types of themes that we look at in the texts, and very importantly, and going back to what you said, Una, about sometimes how do you break that relationship with the literary text, which is what Amanda Coogan and Dumb Theatre the Deaf did so brilliantly, because that opens up so much. And sometimes the only way to do that is to give the work to the students in the studio and just really open it up and allow all the interpretations, good, bad, or indifferent, to mix and work together. So I suppose I think that's really what I've learned, is to come back and to trust the work, that it's all in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what Caroline Byrne did so wonderfully too in her production. She wasn't afraid to work with Monregan and take what she wanted from the dialogue. What the dramaturgical work did actually on that production in the Abbey was it tightened the focus of the production to this wonderfully expressive, evocative moment, which of course was supremely intensified by the set, the staging, the costuming, the soundscape within the production. I think, yeah, Deevy is the right person. She's the right dramatist to read right now, if you're any age. But I suppose, as Kate said, we're so lucky in our work. We love teaching. We love the time spent with our students who teach us so much. And their reading of Deevy's work is so informative and inspirational, informed by their own questioning of aspects of social justice, of challenging prejudice, of being activists around, improving society. And that is inspirational. I mean, we are very lucky, Kate.
Absolutely. And I suppose, I remember Una really started so much of this work for me. She organised an exhibition entitled Deevy, A Quiet Subversive. And I think in that first lecture, Una, you gave, you were talking about a letter that Deevy had written to the Irish Examiner asking who were the censors. And, that question, like Mike, going back to what you asked about kind of what have we learnt and how do we revise this canon, it's asking that difficult question, who are the censors, and acknowledging our own part that we play in that. And that's really difficult and important. And that's when you do that, and when you can do it in collaboration with a great colleague or with the students, it makes it that bit easier.
And to be inspired as well by the other part of that quotation. She said, who are the censors? And how, in the case of proven incompetence, can they be removed? I have to say, I love that sense of frustration and anger. And, that woman is going to say something that will upset somebody very soon, and she's going to get into trouble for it. And sometimes she's going to be right and sometimes she's going to be wrong, but she's going to annoy people on the way. And for anybody who knows me, they know I channel that.
Before we go, could I just ask, where might people learn a little bit more about Deevy and her career and her work?
There is a wonderful archive, the Teresa Deevy archive, which is housed in the University of Maynooth. And they have many resources available online. And they've got lots of resources that you can go to if you happen to be in Maynooth. But I appreciate that's a difficult voyage for many. The Teresa Deevy archive in Maynooth is a place where you can absolutely go to get information. And we have learned in our own work on Deevy the value of collaborating with archivists and with librarians who know so much about the collections in their care, and how important it is actually, particularly for younger researchers, to maybe take that step and go into a special collection, spend some time there. There are lots of original, interesting documents in there that maybe nobody has ever read, or that have been categorized maybe inaccurately, that you might find a lead to take you on a journey that is completely unique to your own interests and that will add a little bit to the scholarship that's in place already.
We'll post links in our show notes that will let you explore Teresa Deevy's career and legacy, as well as the ways in which artists and scholars like Una and Kate have been reviving interest in her work. Kate and Una, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theatrehistorypodcast.net and follow @theatrehistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.